Why were Italian tanks so bad? 1921 to 1943. During the Western Desert Campaign in North Africa in 1942, the Allied soldiers often joked about how many gears an Italian tank had, answering 1 forward and 4 reverse. The implication was that the Italians would run away at the first sign of a fight. The truth was that while their tank crews were undoubtedly brave in combat, they lacked decent modern-day equipment and were hampered by extremely poor leadership. The Italians were early to utilize the concept of the tank, introducing it into their armed forces as far back as 1921 in the form of the 6-ton Fiat 3000, which was based on the French World War I Renault FT-17 design. Though it had proved popular with the Italian army, they realized that the tank was too lightly armed, having just 2 6.5mm light machine guns, so in 1930 they upgraded it with a 37mm cannon, along with a more powerful engine and better suspension. The Fiat 3000 had a top speed of only 13 miles per hour, which was still better than the Renault FT-17 that was based on, which could only manage a mere 4.3 miles per hour, or 7 kilometers an hour. Its armor didn't offer much protection, only varying between 6 and 16 millimeters thick, so it could just about stop a bullet going through it, but didn't stand a chance against an anti-tank round. And with a range of just 65 miles, this tank was more suited to the slow World War I type of fighting across the muddy stretches of no man's land than it was with the fast-moving tactics of World War II. Even if the Fiat 3000 did try to get away, an enemy soldier could easily just sprint after it and simply knock it out with a hand grenade. Incredibly, despite these tanks being so inferior to all other tanks and over 20 years old, it was still in limited service when the Allies invaded the Italian island of Sicily in 1943. The Italian infantry support tank at the time of World War II was the CV-33 tankette that had first entered service in 1933. It was mostly based on a British design that dated back to 1927. It was inexpensive, built in large numbers, and exported to many other countries. Nevertheless, with its range and armor being similar to that of the Fiat 3000, it was woefully outdated by the time World War II came along. Though to its credit, it was quite fast and nimble, with a top speed of 26 miles per hour, or 42 kilometers an hour, which is comparable to the famous sprinter Usain Bolt running at full speed. But its 2-man crew were housed in a ridiculously small crew compartment, for the tank had a height of just 3 feet 11 inches or 1.2 meters and was only 4 feet 7 inches wide or 1.4 meters. This meant it was far smaller than your average modern-day compact or economy class car. This made it very uncomfortable for its crew members, so much so that the commander would, whenever possible, sit on top of the tank in order to give the driver some much-needed elbow room when he was driving the CV-33. It was so ineffective that during the North African campaign that ran from 1940 to 1943, it was not deployed on the front line, instead being used in non-combatant roles like towing light artillery around and guarding bases in the rear. But the Italian army knew it desperately needed to modernize its armored units, and in 1940 started to introduce a new medium tank, the M1340. It was based on the design of the British Vickers 6-ton tank. This tank was of a good design, if it had been introduced 10 years earlier, but by 1942, it was already starting to become hopelessly outdated. And with its small 12-ton frame and underpowered engine, it meant that, unlike the US Sherman or German Panzer IV, there wasn't much scope for any modifications. It was also hampered by its very small turret, which meant that the commander and gunner found it hard to work effectively alongside each other. The M1340 had numerous drawbacks, yet over 700 were built as it was the only medium tank available to the Italian army at the time. Its armor was also relatively thin and not sloped, and worse still, it was not welded together, but of the old-fashioned riveted construction. This meant there was always a danger that when hit, the impact might dislodge a rivet and send it at high speed, ricocheting around the interior of the tank like shrapnel, and either hitting a crew member or damaging equipment and instruments. A further complication was that the steel used to construct the armor plate was of such poor quality that even if it was not actually penetrated by an incoming round, it was so brittle that it would start to crack and become warped on impact. This would weaken that part of the armor considerably. Even the US-made stopgap tank, the M3 Lee, or the British equivalent, the M3 Grant, was more than a match for it. Though the M1340 did have one important advantage in that it was one of the first tanks to use a diesel engine. This offered a far longer range and extended engine life than the petrol equivalent and was less likely to burst into flames when hit. Like most Italian fighting vehicles at the time, it was unreliable, and this was not helped by the harsh desert environment it found itself in during the North African campaign. And the fact that the Italians had no formal system of recovering battle damage or broken down tanks meant many were simply abandoned on the battlefield when they broke down or were damaged. If they had been recovered, they could have been repaired and returned into service. So in the long North African campaign, it was totally outclassed and consistently defeated by the Allied tanks in combat. This was not helped by the fact that early on in the campaign, the M1340s were deployed with crews who had only minimal training, and there was no communication between the tanks as they didn't have radio sets fitted in their vehicles. The Italian army soon realized how inadequate the firepower of the M1340 series was, but had yet to develop anything better to replace it. So in 1942, the newly introduced Semovente 7518, which was a turretless mobile artillery self-propelled gun, was often used as a tank destroyer in order to give some much-needed support to the outclassed M1340s. These tanks, with their 75mm gun, proved highly effective, and it is said it was the only Italian tank of the war that the Allies actually feared, as it was more than capable of taking out an M3 Grant or M4 Sherman at a range of 500 yards, or about 500 meters. But with only 262 ever being built, they were never deployed in sufficient numbers to be any kind of serious threat to the Allied forces. Another tank that the Italians had that could have made a real difference was the Semovente 9053 mobile artillery piece. It was hastily designed and built in 1942 to counter the threat of the formidable Russian T-34. The Semovente 9053 had an open top and rear crew compartment, which meant the crew was vulnerable to small arms fire, shrapnel from artillery fire, and adverse weather conditions. And a major design setback was that it used a petrol engine that was prone to bursting into flames when hit, and freezing up when the temperatures got too cold. Also, it had very little armored protection. Its armament was a 90mm or 3.5-inch anti-aircraft gun mounted onto the enlarged chassis of an M1441 tank, and this proved to be extremely effective, being able to knock out the very latest Allied tanks at a long range. But its gun capacity was severely hampered by the fact that it could only carry 6 to 8 rounds of ammunition. Therefore, each gun had to be followed around by a specially converted Fiat L640 tank ammunition carrier, which could carry 26 rounds, with a further 40 rounds in a towed trailer. Only 45 of these combat vehicles were ever built, and it ended up being used in very small numbers in the North African campaign, the rest being used to defend the Italian homeland. So none of them would ever reach the Eastern Front, where no doubt if they had, their crews would have frozen to death in their exposed crew compartments. There was even an attempt by the Italian government to set up a production line in Italy to produce the deadly German Panzer V Panther tank, but this came to nothing as the fascist government there was overthrown in September 1943. The Italians ended up producing a mere 3,368 tanks throughout the war. This made up just over 4% of the overall Axis tank production. This is even less than the number produced by the Imperial Japanese Empire, who had focused most of their resources on their Navy and Air Force at the expense of their army. In the post-war era, the Italians finally produced a world-class tank in the form of the Ariete main battle tank, and is often rated as one of the best tanks in the world.